The night was shrouded in an unnatural quiet, broken only by the howling wind that swept through the deserted streets of the small town of Ravensbrook. Nestled at the edge of the woods stood the Crimson Tavern, a relic of a bygone era, its crimson facade faded and weathered by time. The tavern's name flickered in dim neon, casting an eerie glow on the cobblestone pathway leading to its entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the desolation outside. The air was thick with the smell of aged wood, stale beer, and a lingering scent of something more sinister. The patrons, a motley crew of weary travelers and locals, sat huddled in dimly lit corners, nursing their drinks with a sense of quiet desperation. The bartender, a gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a perpetual sneer, wiped down the counter with a dirty rag, his movements mechanical and devoid of life. The clock on the wall ticked ominously towards midnight, each second adding to the growing sense of unease. At precisely 11:55, the door creaked open and a figure stepped inside. Dressed in a long, dark coat that seemed to absorb the light, the stranger's presence commanded attention. He made his way to the bar, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The stranger took a seat at the bar, his gaze fixed on the bartender. "A drink," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Something special." The bartender's hand trembled as he reached under the counter, producing a dusty bottle of crimson liquid. He poured a generous measure into a glass and slid it across the bar. The stranger lifted the glass to his lips, his eyes never leaving the bartender's. As the liquid touched his tongue, a chill spread through the tavern. The lights flickered, and the temperature dropped, causing the patrons to huddle closer together. The stranger placed the empty glass on the bar and leaned forward, a sinister smile playing on his lips. "Tell me," he said, his voice dripping with malice, "have you ever heard the legend of the Crimson Tavern?" The bartender's eyes widened in fear, but he nodded. "Aye," he whispered. "It's said that those who drink the crimson elixir are cursed to relive their darkest fears until the end of their days." The stranger's smile widened. "Good," he said, "because tonight we're going to see if that legend is true." As the clock struck midnight, the tavern was plunged into darkness. The patrons screamed as they were enveloped by a suffocating blackness, their fears manifesting in grotesque and terrifying forms. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. In the center of the chaos, the stranger stood, his eyes glowing with an unholy light. He raised his arms, and the darkness seemed to obey his command, twisting and writhing like a living entity. The patrons' screams grew louder, their terror feeding the malevolent force that had taken hold of the tavern. One by one, the patrons succumbed to their fears, their bodies contorted in agony as their minds were consumed by the darkness. The bartender, his face a mask of terror, tried to escape, but the stranger's gaze held him in place. "There's no escape," the stranger whispered, his voice echoing in the void. "The Crimson Tavern has claimed you, and your soul is now mine." The bartender's scream was the last sound that echoed through the tavern before it was swallowed by the darkness. The stranger's laughter filled the void, a chilling reminder of the price paid for a drink at the Crimson Tavern. As the first light of dawn broke through the windows, the tavern returned to its previous state, as if nothing had happened. The patrons, now lifeless husks, sat slumped in their seats, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The bartender lay motionless behind the bar, his eyes wide open in a final, silent scream. And in the midst of it all, the stranger stood, his sinister smile unwavering. He lifted the dusty bottle of crimson liquid and poured himself another drink, savoring the taste of his victory. For in the Crimson Tavern, where every drink comes with a side of terror, the night never truly ends. The Crimson Tavern stood as a silent sentinel, its crimson glow now fading in the harsh light of dawn. But for the townsfolk of Ravensbrook, the events of that night were far from over. Whispers of the tavern's dark past spread like wildfire, and fear began to seep into the very fabric of the town. Among the townsfolk was Eleanor Grey, a young journalist with a knack for uncovering the truth. Her curiosity was piqued by the rumors surrounding the Crimson Tavern, and she resolved to uncover the secrets that lay hidden within its walls. Armed with a notebook and a determination that bordered on obsession, Eleanor made her way to the tavern as the sun began its descent. The tavern's door creaked open under her touch, and she stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick with the remnants of last night's terror, and the silence was deafening. Eleanor's eyes scanned the room, taking in the lifeless forms of the patrons, their faces frozen in expressions of sheer horror. Her gaze fell on the bartender, his lifeless eyes staring blankly into the void. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine, but she pushed the fear aside and approached the bar. She noticed the dusty bottle of crimson liquid, still sitting on the counter, and her curiosity got the better of her. Eleanor reached for the bottle, but as her fingers brushed against it, a cold, clammy hand clamped down on her wrist. She gasped and looked up to see the stranger, his eyes glowing with an unholy light. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said, his voice sending shivers down her spine. Eleanor yanked her hand away and took a step back. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The stranger's smile was chilling. "I am the keeper of the Crimson Tavern," he said, "and you, my dear, are about to become its newest guest." Before Eleanor could react, the room was plunged into darkness once more. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the walls seemed to close in around her. She heard the whispers of the lost souls, their voices filled with anguish and despair. Eleanor's heart raced as she stumbled through the darkness, her mind consumed by fear. She could feel the presence of the stranger, his gaze burning into her soul. "You cannot escape," his voice echoed in the void. "The Crimson Tavern has claimed you, and your darkest fears will be your undoing." As Eleanor's terror mounted, the darkness began to take shape. She found herself standing in a familiar place, her childhood home. But something was terribly wrong. The walls were covered in blood, and the air was thick with the sound of screams. She saw her parents, their lifeless bodies hanging from the ceiling, their eyes wide open in a final, silent scream. Eleanor's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, her mind struggling to comprehend the horror before her. The stranger's laughter filled the air, a chilling reminder of the power he held. "Your darkest fears are now your reality," he said, "and there is no escape." Eleanor's mind was consumed by terror, and she felt herself slipping into the darkness. But in the depths of her despair, a spark of determination ignited within her. She couldn't let the stranger win. She had to find a way to break free. With a renewed sense of purpose, Eleanor pushed herself to her feet. She could feel the darkness closing in, but she refused to give in. She stumbled through the blood-soaked corridors of her childhood home, her mind racing for a way to escape. As she rounded a corner, she saw a faint light in the distance. With every ounce of strength she had left, she ran towards it, her heart pounding in her chest. The light grew brighter, and she could feel the darkness receding. Eleanor burst through the doorway and found herself back in the Crimson Tavern. The patrons were still lifeless, but the oppressive darkness had lifted. She turned to face the stranger, her eyes blazing with determination. "I will not let you win," she said, her voice steady. "I will uncover the truth, and I will break the curse of the Crimson Tavern." The stranger's smile faded, and for the first time, Eleanor saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "You cannot escape," he said, his voice shaking. "The Crimson Tavern has claimed you." But Eleanor stood her ground, her determination unwavering. She would uncover the truth, and she would put an end to the terror that had plagued the Crimson Tavern for centuries.